Now we get into the baseline. Now, why do we get into the baseline on this stuff? Well, because if we're going to actually talk about fundamentals or even anything next level, then I have to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? And this is some very very basic stuff. Now, a part of the problem that we as seasoned service guys have is we forget about the basics. You ever been out on a job and it just ate your lunch? You were there for a very long time, and what it came down to was something just so simple that you've actually overlooked it. But even worse, have you ever had one of the new guys come out and he looked at it and figured it out right away? Now, why is that? Well, that's a pretty easy one, really, when you think about it. It's because, one, you got a fresh set of eyes on it. That always helps. They look at things differently than you do, and maybe the different angle will lend itself to a different diagnosis. And two, the second one, probably the most important one, is they're at that stage in their career where basics are where they start every time. It's like going through the same routine for a jumper before he makes a long jump. It's the same routine every single time, so that way they can lead into the result that they're looking for. And so the fundamentals are what they've learned most recently, and so they diagnose based on expansion from the fundamental processes. So these are what I consider to be the most basic elemental parts of the air conditioning system. This should absolutely go without saying. I kind of feel as though I make us all a little bit dumber just saying it. But you have to know what you're working on. So when you think about it, if somebody's telling you what I'm telling you, meaning you have to learn to look at what you're actually working on before you work on it, you think they're crazy. You think they're maybe overstepping their bounds. You think to yourself, man, I know this stuff. Why is he telling me that? Well, look at that sticker in the left-hand side there, the R22 sticker. For about 4.5 years, the industry made hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of dry charge R22 units. Now, do you think when R22 went up to 2 or 3 times the price of retrofit refrigerants, that people were still putting R22 into those dry charged units? The answer is pretty simple. No, absolutely not. If you've got R22 that was selling for $400 or $500 for a 30-pound cylinder, and you've got new 22 that was selling for $125 for a 25-pound cylinder, well, it's a no-brainer. There were lots of people that performed a retrofit right from the get-go because that was less expensive, and going forward, the retrofit refrigerant wasn't currently in a phase out, and so that was almost a no-brainer for those folks. But unfortunately, oftentimes they didn't mark that they did a retro right from the beginning, that they put a different refrigerant in there. And that's difficult for us to keep pace with if there's no Sharpie mark on there that they did something with a different refrigerant, or there's no sticker on there or anything like that. That's really difficult to keep up with. Okay, but you have to know what you're working with. You have to look for that sticker. It may not be there, but hopefully it is. Look at the bottom sticker, the R32. In our industry, manufacturers are quickly jumping on board with R32 as the future of this industry in the residential commercial markets. Now, it's a single component refrigerant. The upper end efficiency is more efficient than what we're working with right now in 410A. The head pressure is lower, and overall, it sounds to be like it's going to be a better refrigerant. The problem is, how many people have worked with R32? For that first year, how many times are you going to look for an R32 sticker when you go out to the job site? Okay, and how many times are you going to look at that green label and think instead of R32, it's R22? Okay, take the time to realize the situation that you're working on may not be the same today as it was yesterday, as it was 20 years ago. Every job is different. Every call is different. Every day is different. So start them out with the mentality of a child and empty your mind. And when you go out there and work on this stuff, treat every job like it's completely different. Okay? Know what you're working on. The biggest difference that you're going to get here are handling requirements. The pressure temperature chart will be different for each of these, which will affect your overall superheater subcooling if it's necessary for you to check those things. Okay, so make sure that you actually look to make sure what you're working on. For our basic overall view, this is what I am talking about when I'm talking about basic. It doesn't matter if this is a residential split or if this is a light commercial application where you've got a split on an office building. The application is the same, right? On the right-hand side here, we've got our condensing unit. Our service valves are found on the condensing unit. That's where we're going to check our charges. We've got a line set going between the outside condensing unit and the inside coil, which oftentimes will be in a basement. Maybe it'll be in a mechanical room, could be in an attic. But we've got our coil in there somewhere, and going into that coil off of the high side, you're going to have the metering device. It may be an expansion valve, it may be a piston. On this particular one, you can't tell, right? Oftentimes, you could have that piston mounted inside, you could have that expansion valve mounted inside, and that affects everything if you got to check your charge. You can't do your superheater subcooling unless you know what kind of metering device you've got. So you have to physically put your eyes on what you're working with. Okay, but that expansion valve or that piston is going to play a big part in whether or not this thing cools correctly. And then, of course, we've got it sitting on top of a furnace. Or it could just be possibly an air handler or something like that, depending on the area of the United States. Okay, this is our basic fundamental setup. These are service ports. When I'm referring to service ports, high side or low side, these are what I'm talking about. Okay, now on the left-hand side here, we've got our high side. Now the high side on this particular unit and on many of the residential type splits, and even in some of the commercial or light commercial splits, you're going to have that high side be a 3/8 line. And they also refer to that as the liquid line. On the suction side of things, or the low side of things, ironically, you're going to have a bigger line. And usually the difference between those two is also going to be a temperature. Although with the efficiency ratings continually going up, you're starting to notice less and less difference between those two, with people being more keenly aware of how to charge these properly and getting the airflow proper and cleaning the coils outside. All those kinds of things play an effect on this refrigerant as it travels through the system, more particularly in the difference in the suction and liquid line side temperatures. Okay, so but the suction side generally is going to be your cooler side of the system. These are what we're talking about: liquid line, suction line. On a commercial application or a rooftop application, this would be probably a little bit more common to what you'd be seeing out there. You're still going to have your suction line or your discharge line or your suction line and a discharge line or a high side line. Sometimes you're going to have series compressors like this or parallel compressors like this. They'll look very, very similar, and sometimes you have to take a second and step back and actually look at the application to make sure that you can find the high side and the low side so you're hooking up your gauges properly. Now, sidebar on this, when you're looking at the rooftops like this, one of the problems that we get with checking charge on a rooftop unit is oftentimes we got to leave that door open. Because our gauges have hoses on it, and we string our gauges outside and kind of brush the door up against the edge to keep the condenser fan from pulling all the air through that opening, right? Because if we do that, then the coils overheat and it gives us a bad pressure rating. There are newer more modern gauges that don't require you to have hoses to bring outside to look at your manifold set. They go to an app on your phone, so you can transmit that from inside of there, which allows you to put the door all the way back on the rooftop unit, so that it runs as though it was normal everyday operating procedures, and it's not able to draw the air through that open door and give you a misdiagnosis because the coils are running too hot or not drawing enough air through those. So that's just kind of a sidebar. Now this is interesting. There are some locations that would not accept any sort of training unless the hoses were color coded correctly. And I understand that. For the purpose of fundamentals and basics, you've got to know that when we're talking about the high side of the system usually is going to hook up to the gauges on your manifold. The gauge on your manifold on the right-hand side usually is going to be your red gauge or your high side gauge. And below that, the actual hose that goes down to the high side connection point on the service ports is also going to be a red hose. So you'll have a red gauge and a red hose. On the low side of the system, the low side will have a blue gauge, and it'll have a blue hose hooked from the manifold down to the suction ports. And ideally, this is the way it will always be, but the reality of it is, no matter whether you're hooking all yellow hoses up, all blue hoses up, all red hoses up, or some configuration of the three, as long as they're hooked up at the right spot on the manifold below the right gauge, they're going to work the same. The hoses are made exactly the same. The color coding just makes it easier and quicker to spot out which side of the system is, that we're looking at or that we're hooked up to. So keep that in mind. And of course, when you look at it from this angle, where we've got the yellow hose is generally accepted to be your vacuum, recovery, or charging hose. Okay, so in that setup, we've got our gauges hooked up to our condensing unit. We've got the low side, which is blue. We've got the high side, which is red. Each of those hooked up to the respective service ports on the condensing unit. And we've got the yellow side not hooked up to anything because we're not charging anything right now. We're not recovering or pulling a vacuum. So it's just still hooked up to the manifold. The next thing we've got to be really diligent on is where we hook up our thermometers, right? And there's a couple of different ways you can hook up thermometers. I've done both of them. Both of these pictures that you see here are mine in the field. The green thermometer here is just a regular old pocket thermometer, and I've got it stuck under the Armaflex. Guys have done that for decades, long before my time, and I'm sure long after my time. Less critical charge makes a bigger run for the industry. Hey, but when you're using a pocket thermometer under the Armaflex like we've got right here, there's a couple of things you got to keep in mind. One, you want to be at least 6 inches away from the service port. And two, you don't want that thing sitting or resting on a fitting, on a coupling, a 90, anything like that, because it's thicker and you're going to have a brazing compound between there, and those things could all lead up to a missed reading on your temperature reading. So, and this is going to be important, right? Because if we're checking the temperature on the line set on the low side of the system, then that means we're probably actually utilizing that temperature as part of our superheat value, because superheat is simply a difference between the temperature on your low side gauge and the temperature on the low side thermometer. You subtract those, that gives you your superheat. So that's a very important measurement that we're taking there. Now, as you see in the other photo where we've got the clamp-on thermometer, this makes really no difference. We're still a digital thermometer. A lot of people use the clamp-ons now because one, they're easier, they stay there, you don't have to secure them, whereas the pocket thermometer, if you put it under the Armaflex, it's nice and loose, so you could really get a misdiagnosis if you don't take a little Velcro strap or something and go around the actual thermometer so that way you have a nice tight fitting. Whereas the clamp-ons, they just clamp on. They're tight already. And oftentimes the clamp-ons are the ones that are connected to the digital meters. And those digital meters, whether it's a voltmeter or it's a superheater subcooling gauge that will do all the subtraction for you, they just usually use those because they're simple and they'll stay on to any line set as long as it's sized properly. You have to have something inside, right? When you're looking at the modern equipment, it used to be that we would take a dry bulb thermometer and we would just drop it down in the return air by the filter box, or we would just drop it into the 30-inch register in a hallway underneath the thermostat. And times have changed. The dry bulb thermometer reading is very, very rare to be used as part of the charging procedures. Now think about that. Why? What do we use instead of it? Well, we use the wet bulb reading. And what's the difference between wet bulb and dry bulb? Well, to keep it simple, wet bulb takes into consideration humidity, right? It's not enough to blow out cool air. A fan in the right in the right scenario will blow out cool air. A swamp cooler blows out cool air. But are we dehumidifying the air that's being blown out? Because that's what they call the feels like temperature. The industry has changed over the past several years to not just make sure that the air is blowing out cool and everything. It's also, is the equipment sized properly so that it's also dehumidifying the way that it should? Because if it's dehumidifying the way that it should, it'll feel much cooler than the actual set point thermostat temperature. So the customer will feel better. If they feel better, they're going to run it better. It'll cost them less money. So you have to have something to check the wet bulb thermometer reading in the home. Now, what you see this gentleman here holding is just a digital psychrometer. And some of the guys use the old sling psychrometer, right? It looks like a set of nunchucks. I used to use that too. You twirl it around like this. You've got a wet wick on there. You put it back together and you slide it apart and it tells you what the wet bulb reading is. Very, very accurate. Well, the digital technology has come miles and miles since then. And because there's more people using digital than there are sling, you have seen the price drop incredibly, so that the digital and the sling are not really all that far apart. And the digital is very quick and it's accurate down within tenths of degrees. And so if it's quick and it's accurate, then I'm probably going to use it. And that's what you see here with this gentleman. Now, the second side note, another reason that I like the digital thermometer, okay, like this, or the digital psychrometer, it allows me to give my customer a job and they can't repeat that job when I leave and hurt themselves, right? This is a pretty innocent job. Now think about it. Okay, this gentleman right here is sitting in the dining room area looking at the wet bulb thermometer. Now, why is he doing that? And I'll tell you why he's doing that. Because he was henpecking me. And as he was henpecking me, really, he wasn't trying to be rude, but he wanted to help. And so I simply asked him if he wanted to help. And of course he did want to help. So I gave him a job that he couldn't hurt himself with. I said, okay, now this is probably one of the most important things of all of my charging procedures, which it is a very important thing. I said, what you see on this psychrometer is going to tell me whether or not your system is charged properly. So I sent him inside, set him down at a well-circulated area of the home, right? It used to be everybody took their measurements right by the return air. Okay, but we don't set our chairs by the return air, so that doesn't do us any good. What we need to do is we need to make sure that the area that the customer is spending time in feels comfortable so that they're setting the thermostat properly. So this gentleman was in the dining room. There wasn't a heavy amount of window, so you don't have the sun radiating in. So I had him take his temperature reading there, and I set him down at the table. And what I did was I gave him an unreal number that would never achieve, so he'd never come back out and henpeck me again. I says, okay, now you sit down and you tell me when this thing reaches 90 degrees wet bulb. Of course, I had set it already to wet bulb, so all I had to look for was 90. And we know it's never going to reach 90 degrees wet bulb. It's not a rainforest in his house, right? So I kept ribbing him every time I walked by. So I have my stuff set up outside. I'm checking the filter, going back and forth downstairs for different readings. And every time I go by, I thought you were going to let me know when it got to 90 degrees. Well, he says, well, it never did. And I said, well, what did it get to? Because that's what I really need to know. He said, well, it only got up to 64 degrees. Okay, we'll keep watching it. Let me know if it gets there. Right? The 64 degrees is really all I needed to know. That's what I'm plugging into the slide rule. So as I'm doing that, I'm giving him a job. He feels helpful and useful. I'm getting information that I need from him. And when I leave, he's probably telling his buddy, I don't know if this is a two-person job or what, but I tell you one thing, I worked my butt off, and he couldn't have done it without me, that's for sure. I should get paid or a little discount or something, and that's okay, because he's not going to forget that. And I got to do my job without somebody henpecking me. Works good both directions. So taking your outside reading. Outside reading is usually always going to just be a simple dry bulb reading someplace away from the condenser, right? We don't want the warm air from the condenser to change our reading. We want what they call ambient outside temperature. It's actually the temperature going through those coils is what he's looking for. And so when you look in the lower left-hand corner, I actually have a pocket thermometer with a magnet on the back of it stuck to the condenser coils. Now what that's doing is the air is being drawn through those coils and out the top of the condenser, so you can't get much more accurate than that. As long as I'm not in the direct beating sunlight on that thermometer, I'm getting a very accurate measurement of what the temperature of the air is going through those coils. Now again, a side note, I've also found that if you stick your thermometer to the side of the condensing unit like that, you're going to probably go through a lot of thermometers. You're going to forget them. And unfortunately, oftentimes the places we forget them are the ones that had given us problems or troubles or are really far away. And for whatever reason, in our own mind, it's just easier to buy a new thermometer than it is to go back to wherever we left it. So if you stick it to the side of the condensing unit, try to stick it someplace you're not going to forget it, because you will go through a lot of thermometers. And also, this gentleman that's holding the thermometer, you want to make sure also that you're not holding that thermometer up in the direct sunlight either. Now this day it was a cloudy day, so we don't have any radiant energy of the sun affecting that or anything, but that's something to keep in mind as a pretty legitimate factor. Should look something like this, right? The way that we've got all of this hooked up with our multimeter taking our temperature reading, which on the modern multimeters, such as the one that's pictured here, you could take your temperature reading and then you're also could be taking your amp draw reading at the same time. We also have our gauges hooked up and we have our thermometer hooked up. So we're able to see everything and how it's affecting that system as it's running in real time. If I was to have this thing operating and then go in and decide, oh my goodness, I forgot to check the filter and the filter stopped up, and I pull that thing out and put a new one in, I'm going to see in real time how that affects the charges, how that affects the temperature that's on the line set there for my superheater, my subcooling, whichever side of the system I'm checking. I'll be able to see all that in real time, and for me, that's very, very important. So I'm not the type of person that likes to use one thermometer for every reading or one set of this or that for every reading. I want everything hooked up at once. I'll use several thermometers, maybe even use several manometers, anemometers, whatnot. Now, back in the olden days, the thought process was, well, boy, you can't use more than one thermometer to take your readings, because what happens if one of those thermometers is off in one direction or the other? Then it's going to throw your temperature measurements off. That was back in the days when the thermometers had a dial on them, right? And the dial had bellows in there, or maybe went off of some kind of a anticipator movement, something like that that could actually have some mechanical decomposition over time. The modern thermometers, one, you can calibrate it. So if you're in doubt that your thermometer is calibrated properly, put it in a glass of ice water. If it doesn't read 32 degrees, then you know that you're miscalibrated and you can adjust them. And in addition to that, these things are accurate within tenths of a degree. So the variance on one thermometer to another thermometer is so small that our slide rule charts or our charging methods would not be able to pick up on that small of a difference. So make sure that you're doing as much as possible so that you can see in real time the way that everything you do affects the system.